one of the favorite stories that my wife likes to tell is about 30 days after we return from orbit, we do a functional fitness test. And so we do one within days of returning, and then another one about 30 days after returning. And that is to basically assess where we are fitness-wise. And I came home from that test, and I told my wife, hey, I did pretty good. I met or exceeded all of my pre-flight values. And she was like, okay, that's great. What she likes to tell is that then I went and laid down on the couch and slept for 3 hours straight. So there's still a little bit of ongoing recovery. Well, I just wanted to say how grateful I am in the crew office and FOD from JSC are to have this opportunity to share some lessons learned with you. Really appreciate JD's presentation prior to this and his advocacy for the crew and all of your advocacy for the crew, all of the work that you all do to make sure that our missions are safe and successful. It's been a really interesting experience for me. I think that my background is really as an operator. In the Air Force, I went in flight training. I was an emergency medicine doctor in the hospital. And then here, after astronaut candidate training, I rolled fairly quickly into assign training. And so I've really occupied that user or operator role as long as I've been working, really. And so to come here and to be involved now in the astronaut office, working with the program, I've had the opportunity to really see behind the curtain, to see how the sausage is made, and to see all of the work that you all do. So very, very grateful for this opportunity to hear all of these discussions and the lessons learned that are being shared. Let's see. So from a larger perspective, it's also very humbling to be a part of the team, but that on-orbit piece of the team that ultimately works to those goals of extending our presence in the solar system and improving life back here on Earth. And actually today, we are celebrating the 16th anniversary of the continuous human presence on the space station. So, round of applause for all of you all. And I was actually up there this time last year and got to be a part of the celebration for 15 years. I mean, that's a really remarkable thing when you think about it. And at JSC, we have a flag flying above mission control representing the fact that we have a human in space. And we've had a flag flying there for 16 years straight. That is an incredible thing. We've been doing it safely, and I think we're working very hard to reap the benefits of this incredible orbital platform that we have in space. But this is human spaceflight. And so, and you all know this well, having humans as a part of the equation lowers the risk threshold a little bit. I think we also mitigate risk in some ways. When something breaks on station, we're able to fix it. But the bottom line is that we are human. We make mistakes down here on the ground, and we make mistakes on orbit. There's no getting around it. But what we try to do when we make mistakes are to learn from those lessons, learn from those mistakes, to try not to make the same mistakes over and over, and to share those lessons. We also work very hard to minimize the effect of those mistakes. So minimize the frequency, and then also the severity, to not put ourselves in a position where one switch throw can put the crew or the vehicle at risk. And we do that through a number of mechanisms. We do that through training. We do that through using procedures, through good communication, through teamwork, and those are all the things that I'll be trying to share with you today. So just to give credit where it's due, this presentation is actually one that Tom Marshburn created, another astronaut, and actually an astronaut physician in the office, that he has been taking around to various organizations at JSC to really provide the folks working in all the different disciplines with that on-board perspective. And in addition to that, I reviewed all of when the crews come back from expeditions, they will typically provide 3 to 5 recommendations to really focus, as a focus for change as lessons learned. I reviewed all of those for the past 8 years, and then I seasoned the presentation also with a little bit of personal experience and a few photos. JD stole my joke. I'm a doctor, not an engineer. So I don't have risk matrices. I don't have Monte Carlo simulations. I'm not going to provide any of that to you. My intent is to basically just provide you with the perspective of the crew, what it's like to go through training and to live and work on the International Space Station. So it really starts with training. When we get selected to the astronaut office, I was selected in 2009. When we get selected, we spent about 2.5 years in astronaut candidate training. We were, as you all probably know, lovingly referred to as ASCANs. And we spend 2.5 years learning all of the things that we need to know in order to be assignable to a mission. That is, flying in the T-38, the robotic arm, spacewalk training, Russian language, space station systems. We have to become proficient in all of those things, and that's about 2.5 years. Once that is complete, we pick up technical jobs in the office, and then when we are assigned to a mission, it's another 2 years of training. So all told, for that first-time flyer, it's about 5 years of training for a 6-month mission. So from the beginning of training for a rookie, or from the beginning of training for a veteran, all told, training through the end of the mission is about a 2 to 3 year process. That's a long time to be in training, and you can imagine that much of what we learn is quickly forgotten. Especially the stuff where we have to sit in a classroom and watch a PowerPoint. And it's really the stuff where we are actively engaged doing robotic simulations or being in the MBL, and you develop muscle memory. That's the stuff that we learn. Being in the mock-up and running through a fire response, that stuff sticks with you, and rightfully so. You know, that is a long training flow, 2 years, and I think most folks in the office would agree that there is an opportunity to maybe make that more efficient, and we're certainly working towards doing that. Towards more kind of day-in-the-life type of training, routine operations training, and also just-in-time training on the space station. So some of the more simpler procedures, just getting a 5-minute video that really gives a brief overview, and we found that to be very effective. But the one surprise, I think one of the biggest surprises for me when I got to the space station, and this was a pleasant surprise, is that there was nothing that I was asked to do that I did not feel competent or prepared for. And so that speaks to a terrific training process, probably a little bit overtraining, but it meant that we were checking all of the boxes, and that's a good place to be. But ultimately, over that 2 to 3 years, we have to maintain proficiency in all of these things that are expected of us, so that when we get to the space station, we are ready to execute an EVA, to capture a vehicle with a robotic arm, to ride up and down on the Soyuz, and to respond to emergencies. So all of that training then ultimately leads to this day where we launch. This is an absolutely amazing experience, especially that first time that once you get into orbit, you've been flying for about 8.5 minutes. That third stage cuts off, and you look out the window, and this bright white light is streaming through the window. And it's that first glimpse of the sun's light reflecting off of the crescent of the Earth, and it's unbelievable to kind of finally realize that dream of getting to fly in space, and also to see the fruits of all of the work going into it. But when we get to space, we are typically not well rested. Sure, we protect 2 weeks before launch, where our schedule is reduced, we're in quarantine to keep us healthy. We're trying to make sure that we're well rested when we launch. But once we get to the space station, we've been up for maybe 36 hours on and off. We're drifting off in micro sleep as we're doing our rendezvous. So when we get to the space station, we're actually pretty tired. And then, as JD so eloquently described, once you get to space, you have to deal with space adaptation syndrome, or what was previously kind of called space motion sickness. Now, when I got to space, I felt great. So we came through the hatch, we did a 4-orbit rendezvous, so about 6 hours after launch, we were docking with the space station, and I felt terrific. I floated into the service module. Our Russian colleagues were there. We had just done our PAO event, and they were breaking out dinner, and I was hungry. I'm like, man, this is awesome. I knew that about 70 to 80% of first-time flyers would get space motion sickness or space adaptation syndrome, and I felt terrific. And they were like, oh, you look great, and I'm hungry, and I'm eating. And then I went and took a nap, and then I woke up, and I felt absolutely terrible. And that lasted for about 2 days, such that any time that I focused on something, like I had some light work schedule on my schedule, and it was to change out an RPCM in the lab with Scott Kelly. Just looking at a procedure and trying to read it, I immediately started to feel nauseated. And so just the ability to work was impaired for those first 2 days. The following day, I was supposed to do a small, we had to evacuate the cylinders on the ARED, the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device. And again, I was supposed to do it with Scott Kelly. And so we floated into Node 3 to do this procedure. He started to work on it. I was looking at the procedure, and again, I started feeling nauseated. And so I said, Scott, just hold on a minute. And I felt, I'd only been there for maybe 24 hours at this point, but I felt like it was bad form to throw up right next to somebody. So I grabbed one of our emesis bags and floated over into Node 1 and proceeded to kind of this whole body, vomiting and discovered that while I was moving away from Scott, I had floated right into the downlink camera. So I'm pretty sure there's a downlink of me kind of convulsing and throwing up into one of our bags. I also used up all of the emesis bags on the space station, I found out. So, but after 2 days, I felt terrific and was ready to get to work. That's just the first couple of days. It takes time to really hit so where you're firing on all cylinders up there. It takes time to adapt to that environment, just floating around, just moving around normally without knocking stuff off the walls. It takes 4 to 6 weeks for you to really become fully efficient up there. And the ground does a great job of trying to help us with that. They pad our schedule to give us a little more time in that early on. But it's a learning process. And part of that is really thinking in 3 dimensions. You're no longer, you're using the floor, the ceiling, the overhead, and the deck, all 3 dimensions for stowage and for work. And you get over 4 to 6 weeks, you've certainly become proficient, but that gets better with time. And one of my favorite examples has to do with using Robonaut. So I followed the procedure exactly. I put Robonaut where it was supposed to go. And as I said, I'm a physician by background, so this felt very natural. Like, well, you put the patient right here in the middle. It's kind of like the OR. I'm going to be bending over and doing, to do these on-orbit repairs. And one of the big differences is there's no gravity to help you bend over. So this is an active posture. So you've got to tense your stomach muscles to bend over to do the work. Meanwhile, your back is still getting sore. But, I mean, this is how you do it, right? Well, Scott had been, by this point, Scott had been up there for probably 6 months. And I think a couple weeks later, he was scheduled to do some of this troubleshooting on Robonaut. And he called down and said, hey, do you guys mind if I set Robonaut up on the port wall? Let's see. Oops. And this is one of these kind of innovative, we talked a little bit about innovation yesterday. I think innovation comes from experience and kind of mastering your environment, but also intentionality, really taking time to think, how can I do this better? And so Scott just put Robonaut up on the wall, had great lighting as a result, and all he had to do was basically just to fix his feet to the ground, and then his work area was essentially just right in front of his face. So he wasn't bending over the whole time, and this was a very comfortable position. And this is something that just did not occur to me at all, based on my previous experience and desire to just follow the procedure to the letter. And so there are opportunities as you become familiar with your environment, and Scott is a prime example. He was a master of that environment with the time that he had spent on orbit, and he took the time every day to try and figure out how to do things better. So what I thought I'd do is just run you through a typical day. I know that you're all familiar with how we work in the space station, but just to give you a sense of what a typical day looks like, we'll generally wake up at 6 or 6:30, depending how much time you need in the morning. We have to take time to do morning hygiene, take breakfast, we might watch the news, and then we read the daily summary, which is kind of the ground's summary for what's going to happen that day and to answer any questions that we might have had the previous day. And then also take some time to prepare for that day's work. At 7:30, we will have a daily planning conference with the ground, speak with all of the mission controls to see if there are any issues that need to be addressed. And after that, we get to work. And that involves working on payload, systems maintenance, and if we have any dynamic operations coming up, cargo operations, and exercise. We do 2 hours of exercise every day, as JD spoke to. We get an hour for lunch, and then we do another 6 hours of work after lunch, and end the day with an evening daily planning conference where we kind of wrap up the day and talk about the following day's work. And after that evening DPC, we then have some personal time, and we'll use that to eat dinner, to answer email, to relax and do any personal projects, evening hygiene, and then get to sleep. This is what that schedule looks like, and this is an eye chart, but it's an eye chart on purpose because this is what we have to look at. So you can see horizontally represents each individual crew member, and so that crew member is scheduled over the course of the day. And you can see, so the ops planners are absolute geniuses. They are putting this puzzle together every day, meeting the objectives from the program and from the science folks and packing that, making that real in a schedule. And that is a tightly packed schedule. You can see that if one thing goes wrong, it can have ramifications for the entire day. And so we are very busy moving from one task to another. And these tasks are not all the same thing. We might be doing a PAO event and talking with 4th graders on the ground, going into some cargo transfer activities, then working with the combustion payload, and then doing some systems maintenance. And so it's very fragmented. And honestly, even when you're in an activity, sometimes there will be questions coming up from the ground asking about the status of something that also interrupts that work. So it can be a very fragmented work environment. And it requires problem solving all along the way. So you have to become familiar with what it is that you're going to do, familiar with what the procedure says. You have to go gather your tools. You have to keep your tools organized and try not to lose anything. And as you have your tools, you don't have a toolbox. So anytime you open a bag, everything wants to fly out at you. And so just keeping track of little sockets can be a very challenging thing. So you bring your socket driver and then a couple of sockets. Those things want to, anything that you are not actively keeping track of wants to float away and mess up your day. It happens with fruit too. The fruit likes to get away. And in addition to Optimus, that schedule program kind of dominating our day, procedures are just a part of our life. Everything that we do up there is controlled by a procedure. And so we find that that well-written procedures have the user in mind, really come from that user perspective. There was a time when, for every given activity, we would see separate instructions from the stowage folks, from the procedure itself, from the operations team, and from the planner. And so for every activity, we had to integrate 4 or 5 different pieces of information to execute that activity. And that was a nightmare. And that has gotten a lot better. Another challenge is when we execute a procedure, if we went line by line for every procedure on every activity, we would never get anything done. So there's a balance that we have to achieve of accuracy versus efficiency. And that's something that we struggle with every day. And that is another area where mistakes can be made. And so that's a conversation that we have to have with the ground about, hey, is this something that we can kind of fix a little bit? And again, the ground has done a great job of giving us XML procedures instead of HTML. So these are dynamic procedures that will pull out all of the stuff that does not apply to that particular day's activity. And then you can see some of the things that make procedures well written. So here's some quotes just from, these are actually taken from astronaut journals, a payload where astronauts kind of commented about their experience on station. One of the things that really rings true with me is that last one. So instead of a procedure stating, hey, connect W1543 Alpha-7 to 1 Sierra 34-2, if we have a little bit of forethought, and we plan the hardware correctly, we can say, hey, connect the red to the red and the blue to the blue. And that helps us out a lot. We could handle the W1543, but for efficiency's sake and also just from intuitive aspect, because a lot of this is done on EVA. Let's see. I was taking connectors apart and putting them together outside. And if you have a red that connects to a red and a blue that connects to a blue, that is a godsend. Stowage is another important issue on orbit. So I was at a I think it was a going away party for one of our crew with my wife, and I got to introduce her to our stowage officer. And she said, it sounds a lot like, when we're talking with our kids, she'll always, one of the kids is like, where's my Lego TIE Fighter? And her response will be, well, it must be somewhere. That's not all that helpful for the user, but it's true. I mean, it's got to be somewhere. The stowage ops are absolutely critical for what we do on the space station. They can absolutely clobber us. If you are 3 hours into a 5-hour procedure and you don't have the widget that you need, you can't find it, I mean, you just lost 5 hours, 3 to 5 hours, and we're going to have to reschedule that activity. And everything that we have up there is stowed in one of these CTBs, these cargo transfer bags. It's an opaque cloth bag, so you can't just kind of look into a locker and find the thing you need. You got to take all the bags out, you got to open the bags up and look inside and then close them. Stuff wants to fly out while you're doing that. So it makes it challenging. And careless stowage can put an item absolutely missing forever. So when we get out of the Soyuz, we immediately do Soyuz transfer. All the stuff that we brought up with us, we stow. And I just told you that when we arrive on the space station, we're pretty tired, even for those first couple of days. We're not firing on all cylinders. And so when we arrived on the space station, about 2 weeks in, the stowage folks said, hey, where are Kjell's EVA gloves? And we were like, we're not sure. They're not in the stowage bag where they're supposed to be. And so for about a day, I wasn't going to do an EVA because we didn't know where my gloves were. Now, thankfully, there was a bag that said EVA gloves in the PMM, our stowage area. But without it being labeled on the outside, we would have been in a world of hurt. In fact, while we were disassembling part of the lab, I opened a drawer and I found an EVA tool that had been missing for 8 years. And so there was much joy and exclamation. And Jesse's waving his hand in the back. So that's, you just put something somewhere where it's not supposed to be, and it is lost. Everything has a place on the space station, and one of the challenges that we're really looking at right now is that we're running out of spaces. And that day, again, really speaks to time. So here are a couple of quotes about time living on the space station. What you didn't see on that schedule is this dotted line that runs across the schedule, and that is the present time. And so before we fly, a lot of our colleagues will say, hey, you do the work. Don't worry about keeping up with the red line. Just do the work and do the work correctly. And that's one thing to say it, but when you're on the space station and living it, you cannot help but have your day governed by this expletive dashed red line that is running across the screen. It's hard to keep up with when you first get up there, but over time you get better at it, and you actually build buffer into your schedule by finishing things earlier. And it's a huge transition when you get home to not have a computer that you go to tell you what you're doing and where the red line is for that. So time management is challenging. And you've seen, as we've gone through here, just photos that, many of these are photos that I took. This is Hurricane Jimena, which came up on Mexico while we were up there. And just absolutely amazing to look down and see something this beautiful, but to recognize the amount of power and devastation that it can cause. So speaking about time, we also have downtime, and downtime is critically important. There has to be an opportunity during these long missions, 6 months long, 1 year long, where we have a chance to recuperate and rest our brains. So the time off, we typically have that between the evening DPC and the morning DPC. That's pretty short. That's just, during the workday. But then for the most part, the weekends and then the occasional holiday also belong to us. But even that time, that for relaxation is interrupted by the fact that we have to do exercise still. We'll do 4 hours of housekeeping over the course of that weekend. And occasionally, we can't control when vehicles are going to arrive or when we have to do an EVA. And so sometimes we'll have to do vestibule outfitting in preparation for a vehicle arrival. And so the flip side of that is the accounting for time. This is also critically important. So if you take away 4 hours of our free time over the weekend, it's really nice to be reimbursed for that at some point down the road. And you may not be thinking about it. You may not think it's a big deal, but to the crew it is. And they're thinking about it, and they're keeping very close track. So that when you've taken 4 hours away from their weekend, and you give them 1 hour back on Friday, they're kind of like, I'm not a math major, but, and that can build up resentment and is one of these kind of the currencies of trust between the crew and the ground. One of the other things is that it is variable what we do with our time off. On the weekends, some crews like to do science, and they'll actually ask for additional science or maintenance. Some folks just like to relax and work on personal projects. The gray space during the workday is also different. So you might have a little blank area of gray space. You may get way ahead of the schedule and have opened your afternoon open completely. Most crews will then dive into the task list. Most crews say, hey, DPC to DPC belongs to work. And so even if I finish early, I'm going to find more work, and we're going to get work done for the program. And then, of course, from a crew office perspective, we always emphasize to our crew members how critically important it is to ensure that you are maintaining enough energy reserve, that you are not becoming fatigued, because at any time you might have to do a contingency EVA, at any time you may have to respond to an emergency. It's critically important that you have the reserves to do that. This is what we would do on our downtime occasionally, so it's kind of a dark photo. On Friday nights, we all go down to the Russian segment and spend 2 to 3 hours having dinner with our Russian colleagues. And on Saturday nights, we invite everybody over to Node 1, where we set up a movie night. And so just prior to Scott's arrival, we received a projector, which is kind of right up in here. And then what you can't see out of the picture is a big projector screen. And so we'd have a movie night with our Russian colleagues, and that was always really appreciated. Teamwork, as we all absolutely know, is critically important. So that's on the space station, crew teamwork. We spend a lot of time handing over and making sure that crew members, especially the new guys, are up to speed. Flexible scheduling permits the ability for us to help each other out. And I can't tell you how appreciative I was on a Friday afternoon. Some activity had gone long. We had evening DPC, and we're still having to continue to work on some item. When Kimia, and for myself, Kimia or Scott would roll in and say, hey, how can we help you with this? Let's get this done. And so that teamwork, that desire to help each other out is absolutely critical to good performance on orbit. And then there's also the relationship that we have with the ground, that teamwork. And I was absolutely delighted with the relationship that we had with our ground team. And a big part of it that really comes back to that trust, developed through good communication. We believed that the ground had our priorities in mind. We trusted them, and that all came from very good communication. And some of the things that you can do to enhance that relationship is that, as an example, we have a great relationship with our training teams. We spend hours and hours and hours over the course of 2 years working with those guys. But with the ops team, we don't start working with them until we get on station. Now we have this 250-mile gap between us. So intentional opportunities where we get together and start to know the flight director and all the discipline leads is very important for kind of this on-orbit operation. This is a picture I took of Scott during our return to original configuration, EVA 33. And again, one of these experiences that is absolutely unforgettable. So I talked a little bit about communication, and of course all of these things that I've talked about, the procedures, the teamwork, communication, all of this these are mitigation, part of the mitigation strategy to minimize the severity and frequency of mistakes. We have amazing communication capability on the space station right now. When I hear of Shuttle Mir and the opportunity of the crew to speak with the ground, essentially just being ham radio off and on, now we've got the Russian VHF system, we've got S-band, we've got expanded KU coverage, we've got communication with the ground 80 to 90% of the time, which means that I can pick up the IP phone just about any time and send a call down to my family. We have the opportunity to do video conferences, hour and a half once a week. And so this is all great for crew psychology, but it's also great for excellent communication. It provides a back channel to talk with the flight director at the end of the DPC, where we talked about something specific on the downlink that everybody can listen to, and it's an opportunity to call the flight director or one of the increment leads up and say, hey, so how did this really go? What feedback do you have for me? And that all, again, really enhances the teamwork. It's critically important to close the communication loop with the crew. So as one example, we'll ask as a Capcom, we'll ask the crew, hey, can you go do this? And the crew will say, sure, yeah, I'll go take care of that. And then the flight director will ask the Capcom, hey, did he really understand what we asked him to do? And then the ground will spend 45 minutes discussing among themselves what the crew really understood. And from a crew perspective, we love talking to the ground. Please just call up and ask again to clarify. There's this idea of don't bother the crew, but we also don't want to make a mistake. So I think just adopting that posture of call anytime is super important. The other thing is that the ground can be working critical issues for the crew. As an example, for the return of 47S, I'm sorry, not 47S, for our crew, we did a night landing, which prior to a night landing in the Soyuz, which prior to that night landing was a reason not to do a landing. If we said, hey, can we bring the crew back on this date? The Russians say, no, that's at night. We can't do that. So for the longest time in the ISIS program, we just did not do night landings. And then all of a sudden, we were being told, hey, you're coming down at night. And the ground recognized this as an absolutely critical issue. And they were working that. There was lots of meetings, lots of arguments, and finally became comfortable with it. But you can forget that you've been to, you spent 8 hours over the course of a couple of days talking about this, but the crew hasn't heard anything about it. So we're just up there too, like, well, this is funny. We're doing a night landing. I wonder if people are concerned about this. And so just closing that loop to make sure that the crew understands that you understand how critical these issues are is very important. And then you should tell the crew when they've made a mistake. Again, we all make mistakes, and so it's important to debrief those and to avoid those in the future. And just some comments about a good communication from the astronaut journalists. When I think about mistakes, I remember very clearly working on ARED, and I had to change out a cable on the ARED. So I went into the cargo transfer bag that had the cable, checked the serial numbers, spent 2 hours installing the cable. And right at the very end, as I was going to, there was a C-clamp that just needed to be secured. As I was putting it, the C-clamp was in the wrong direction. And I thought, so I called down and said, hey, the C-clamp does not look like it does in the procedure. I just want to make sure that you guys are okay with this. And they said, hey, can you go check the serial number? And as it turns out, I was installing on the right side, and I had grabbed a left-sided cable. And the only difference between the two was the C-clamp was in a different direction. So we called down, the ground debated it, and the decision came back that, okay, we need you to uninstall it and go get the other one. That sounds like a pretty trivial and minor thing, and in the scope of things it was, but from a crew perspective, man, I beat myself up over that for hours. And you got to get to a point, it's with like all mistakes, you say, okay, I made a mistake, now it's time to fix it, and you move on. but you recognize that you're living in this fishbowl. Everybody's seeing you make this dumb mistake, and it's important to be able to compartmentalize that stuff. And as it turns out, I was supposed to install 1218, and I had installed 1215. And the serial number is in between two pieces of this. So you kind of get a flashlight, and you're like, yeah. And so I had convinced myself that it was 1215. It was the only one in the bag, I thought. So it's very easy to make mistakes like that. And so we, of course, debriefed, how can we do this better in the future? It's a picture of the Grand Canyon, one of those weird lighting effects that makes it look three-dimensional, poking out of the ground instead of going into the ground, but absolutely beautiful. And then just to speak quickly about habitability. So a lot of the things I'm talking about, the truth of the matter is that we are at the 90–95% solution on the space station now for many things. We've been doing this for 16 years, and it is a great place to live and work for long-duration crews. But it is still like going camping. So we have no running water up there. We don't have a dedicated hygiene place, a place to do our sponge baths. So we've alternately been doing it in the where the toilet is, or in our crew quarters, and so that can make things a little uncomfortable. The food is good, but over time, if you're eating the same stuff, the lack of variety can become a drag. Meals were never something that I was looking forward to. I was like, oh, I'm really excited about having meatloaf again. It's just one of those things that you do because you know it's important. The air and water quality is terrific. We talk, anytime that you talk with kids about the fact that we're recycling our urine, of course, there's peals of laughter and everybody's grossed out. And I always say, you really get to a point where you're very comfortable with the idea that you're drinking your own urine. It takes you a little bit longer to get to the point where you're okay drinking all of your crewmates' urine. But truly, the water tastes better, I think, on Space Station than it does in Houston. The issue that we're currently working is carbon dioxide. And I think most crews will tell you that they can feel it when the carbon dioxide level gets high. It impacts us. It impacts our fatigue, our energy reserves, our cognitive abilities, I think. And so the program has been working very hard to help us with that issue. And I think that we're getting to a good place. Exercise is absolutely essential. JD spoke to many of those issues. It's essential for our health, physical health. It's also essential for our mental health. When the toilet breaks down, when the water system breaks down, and when the exercise equipment breaks down, you will absolutely know the crew is all hands on deck to get that stuff fixed, because it is critical to our day-to-day health. And then sleeping can be a challenge as well. So these are all the things that, that are working well right now, but we continue to work to improve. And this is kind of cool as you float by node 1 or node 3. One guy might be on the exercise on the treadmill with his head that way. One person might be on ARED with their head that way, and somebody might be coming out of the WHC with their heads up. And so it really comes clear that we're in a special environment. And that environment is amazing. It's absolutely amazing to work in. It's a challenging one to work in. And that work is critically important. We feel like we are doing work that is important to our future in the solar system and to the lives back here on Earth. And having meaningful work is critically important. The Russians are not as cast on some days, and I think you want to avoid that. But you also want to avoid providing make work, having us go and count gloves, lab gloves, because it then feels like make work and feels like a waste of time. So meaningful work is critical. And just looking at this last one, it's an amazing place to live. There wasn't a single day where, before my launch, I was like, man, I'm going to be seeing the same faces for 5 months straight. What is that going to be like? And truthfully, 3 months into my mission, it hadn't even occurred to me yet. And I really stopped to think about it. I'm like, wow, I've been up here for 3 months, same guys, and it didn't even strike me that it was difficult. And part of that is that we were blessed to have an amazing crew, because there can be interpersonal differences, there can be issues that pop up, but we all work really hard to take care of each other. You take care of yourself first to make sure that you're not weighing the rest of the crew down, but then you take care of everybody else. You spend your day thinking about the other folks. What can I do to make the other folks' days better today? And that's how you get through a long-duration mission like this. And we have excellent support from the ground as well, with the resources providing movies and music, family video conferences, and the ability to talk with our families. And those are going to be challenges as we go forward to Mars. You know, a lot of these resources, the exercise equipment, real-time communication, of course, a lot of that's going to change. This is a cool picture I took of the Milky Way and just happened to catch a lightning flash that got reflected off the solar array. That's one of my favorite photos. And then we get, of course, at the end, for our crew, at the end of 141 days, it meant that our mission was coming to an end. And that is a bittersweet time because you recognize that you have just spent what quite possibly could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity representing this larger community, doing amazing things for our planet. But you've also been away from your family for several months, and so you're eager to get home. And so that's a bittersweet thing. We're very busy at the end, packing up and then continuing to do the science and maintenance that's required. But you're always weighing on your mind with the excitement and disappointment of leaving is that you've got one major hurdle to cross, and that is descending through a fireball and hoping that that parachute opens and you get returned safely to the ground. And that really circles back around to what you all do. And that is that we, you know, JD talked about that concept of LOC and loss of vehicle. I'm not worrying about that stuff while we're getting ready to launch and while we're getting ready to return. We trust you all. That you're going to do the work to make sure that that JD doesn't have to have that conversation with our families. So this is Kate's return. Absolutely beautiful and awesome to have her home. And so some final thoughts. You know, as we think about future vehicles, future missions, just own the onboard perspective. Utilize the human factors, folks. If we incorporate human factors concerns early on in the design of procedures, of software, of equipment, it pays absolute dividends in the end so that we don't have to do the workarounds. Another thought is that our international partnerships are absolutely essential. When I come back and when I talk with folks, just in spite of all the amazing science that we do on the space station, I think that the greatest benefit that this program has provided is that international piece. That this represents what we are able to do working together with former adversaries. You know, just 50 years ago, the thought that we would be working with Japan and Germany or with the former Soviet Union on a project like this is absolutely mind-boggling. And this is proof of what we were able to do when we worked together for peaceful means. The journey, while educational, is often humbling. Thank you for letting us, the crew office, for Flight Operations Directorate, to share these lessons learned. And we look forward to continuing to work with you all on future missions. Thank you.